and I look forward to maybe meeting you after the service. But today I want to talk a little bit about the unfortunate fact that leaders let us down. Aren't you glad you come to church this morning? In fact, it almost feels like a foregone conclusion. We almost expect these headlines now. Another CEO, another athlete, another politician, another pastor, another priest, another scandal. How many times have you seen a leader you look up to or you admire or you emulate be struck down by some sort of event or choice that they've made in their life? It can be painful, it can be disorientating, it can even challenge the way that we view the world. And the question always comes up, well, how did someone with so much power, so much influence, so much potential end up there? So the reality is this isn't a modern question. This is not something that we are only dealing with now. It's something that has challenged humankind for millennia. And when we come to 2 Samuel, which is our text for today, we focus on perhaps the greatest leader, the greatest king Israel has ever had, David, God's anointed. He's described as a man after God's own heart. He has united the nation. He's defeated Israel's enemies, received extraordinary promises from God. And yet, David is still human. Like every king before him, he fails. And so today, I'm going to be taking us through when things go wrong for David. And we find that sort of in the latter half of 2 Samuel. Firstly, I want to give you a little bit of context where we are in the story. This has been a series that we've been journeying with for a little while. Then I want to take a bit of an overview and walk us through that story of David, pulling out just some of the key moments, highlighting the messy and altogether human reality of the great King David of Israel. And what my aim for today is to show that how even David isn't faithful and he makes mistakes, God is faithful to his promise, and how in amongst the mess and the disaster that happens in human life, David actually points us towards the one who will come, the true King, the Messiah, and the fulfillment of God's promise, both to the Israelites and to us today. Sound good? All right, let's jump in. So we are roughly about halfway through our series on the rise and fall of kings. So far, it has been a pretty uphill journey. It's had a couple of sort of ups and downs, but it's broadly been sort of up and to the right. And it seems like Israel is sort of slowly progressing towards a better future. And for the last few weeks, we've been exploring this character of David. Sally and Grattan have bringing us a bit more word on that. The great king of Israel, a man after God's own heart. In the great story of Israel's kings, we are approaching the heights. This has been said to be the start of the golden age for Israel, which hits its stride with David and his son Solomon, which Mark is going to speak a little bit more on next week. And I imagine that for the Israelites, they're really excited at this point. You know, they really wanted a king against God's wishes. They said, no, this is what we want. We want a king. And it's kind of starting to work out a little bit. Yes, there's a bit of mess, but they can kind of see the trajectory where it's getting better. And so David's stock is really high at the moment. He is the king of Israel. People love him. He's winning important battles. He's providing for the nation. However, there's one very important asterisk that the text gives us, and I think it's important to note this out. In chapter 8, it says twice that the Lord made David victorious wherever he went. And so we're supposed to understand that Yahweh is the true hero of this story. It isn't David that's doing this, it's actually God that's driving this forward. But of course, we all know peaks have their dangers. And for anyone that has climbed a mountain, and I am certainly not one of them, unless you count Mount Lofty, which is probably more of a large hill, it is a steep and quick fall if you take the wrong step. Now, the story that follows really requires a whole sermon in itself. And I don't have time to do that today. And the other reality is, as a male in our today's culture, I actually don't have the full experience to give it the depth that it's required. And so permit me, as I go through this next part, to briefly touch on David's initial downfall without much nuance. We can't do it today. And unfortunately, then we can move on to our focus for today. But please forgive me as I sort of move quickly through this. And so many may know the story well, but David isn't at war. His army is, but he's decided to stay home. And he's sent Joab out with his men and the army. And he's got up from a nap and he's walked out onto his sort of terrace and he's looked down and seen Bathsheba bathing on the roof. And he knew what he wanted and he took it. It's an awful story of leadership abuse and the beginning of a downward spiral for David and his house. Bathsheba becomes pregnant. David tries to cover it up by ordering her husband Uriah to be assassinated on the battlefield. It is a tragic story of failure that ends in a chilling line, which happens in 2 Samuel 11, and I think really a turning point in David's story. It says, but the thing David had done displeased the Lord. Or another translation, but the thing that David had done was evil in the sight of the Lord. And so at the height of David's power, of his fame, David chooses sin by sexual abuse and by the sword. He has stopped blessing those around him and instead has brought them shame and death. It is a significant zag in the story of David. And how many times, I wonder, have we seen this pattern play out in our lives, the lives around us? And unfortunately, when we're talking about leaders, it seems to be regularly happening in the church. I'm sure you've seen the headlines in the news over the last few years. A leader who seems to be at the height of their ministry, you can see the fruit coming in, people gravitating towards their ministry, yet sin comes in and the whole ministry comes crashing down, destroying the very thing that they were actually going to build. Over 3,000 years have passed, and we still see leaders falling into this same temptation. It tells us something, that these stories in the Bible are trying to communicate something, that we aren't so dissimilar. And David's story, while miraculous in many ways, his full sort of story, it's also deeply human. It's messy, but it's relatable. And so the story continues where David is confronted by Nathan, who is a prophet. And he tells a story, a bit of a parable that seems sort of rightly unfair to David. So the parable is, there were two men in a certain town, one rich and the other poor. The rich man had a very large number of sheep and cattle, but the poor man had nothing except one little ewe lamb he had brought. He raised it, and it grew up with him and his children. It shared his food, drank his cup, and even slept in his arms. It was like a daughter to him. Now a traveler came to the rich man, and the rich man refrained from taking one of his own sheep or cattle to prepare a meal for the traveler who had come to him. Instead, he took the ewe lamb that belonged to the poor man and prepared it for the one who had come to him. And so Nathan tells this story, and it makes David so angry. So angry that he says this man that we're talking about must die. Really extreme words, but we've got to remember this is based in an honor-shame culture. And so this was a really big deal that he would dishonor a man like that. And shame required punishment. It's worth noting that in the Torah, which is the Jewish teaching literature, makes up about the first 5 books of the Bible, the punishment for murder and adultery, both of which David committed, is death. And then Nathan comes back with this incredible line when David's anger is what is heard. He says, "You are that man." Can you imagine the sort of the feeling in the room at that point? David must have felt this sort of immense shame. I imagine it like that dropping feeling in your stomach when someone points out that you've done something wrong, the guilt sort of pouring over you. David immediately at this feeling acknowledges his sin and confesses what he has done, which is great. But David faces quite the problem here. He has outed himself as deserving death. Yet we know, as we read our Bibles, that David doesn't die. So what's going on here? There is a key line in Nathan's rebuke of David. It's in verse 9, and we read, "Why did you despise the word of the Lord by doing what is evil in his eyes?" Now, the word used here for word has a couple of meanings. One, of course, is the word handed down by God through the 10 Commandments. And for David, that makes a lot of sense. Thou shalt not murder and thou shalt not commit adultery. Pretty straightforward. But the second adds a little bit more context. When Nathan says the word, he's also referring to a promise that God made to David, like when you give someone your word. In this case, it is a reminder of the great things that God has done in David's life and will go on to do, a fulfillment of that promise. And this promise comes in 2 Samuel 7, verses 11 to 16. The Lord declares to you that the Lord himself will establish a house for you. When your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son. When he does wrong, I will punish him with a rod wielded by men, with floggings inflicted by humans' hands. But my love will never be taken away from him as long as I took it away from Saul, whom I removed from before you. Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever. While David deserves death, he has outed himself in this. God gave a promise, and God is faithful. So regardless of what David deserved, God will not abandon him because that is outside God's nature. That same grace that we see happening in this story is actually available for us here and now. The same act of pure love when God's mercy, not because it's deserved or earned by anything we do, but simply because it is in God's nature. We have access to that grace. If we're honest with ourselves, we rebel against God each and every day. We fall into temptation, be it sexual, be it financial, be it pride, whatever it is for you. And because of this, we are led in a way of life that leads to death. Yet, God is faithful. God has made a promise to us. Through Jesus, his son, we are promised adoption into the kingdom of God. God, in his love and mercy, consistently chasing after his people, the narrative that we watch over and over again in the Bible, has made a way for us, all of us, to be with him regardless of our past or future, so long as we look to him. Like David, regardless of where we fall short or are unfaithful, God is faithful and God will not abandon us. I don't know where you're at today with God. If you're feeling like you've slipped away, your paths have sort of gone in different directions, perhaps you feel like you aren't good enough or you aren't living the life that you should. Can I just confirm for you today that you are never too far, never too unfaithful, never living so outside God's plan for you, because there is nothing beyond God's love for you. Please know that today. Have you ever said something in the heat of an argument that was a little bit over the line, or something so terrible and hurtful, you kind of almost immediately regret at the moment that it comes out your mouth? On far too many occasions, I have lashed out to those around me with hurtful words. And while I've apologized, sometimes sooner, sometimes not so soon, I have some very gracious people around me who will forgive me, and the relationship can continue to heal and grow, which is great. But the fact is, I've still said those words. They have had an impact, they have wounded, and it will have consequences with that relationship as it moves on. And so while David has confessed here, there are still consequences for his actions. Through Nathan, God declares that the sword will never depart his house. And so I want to continue on with our story today, and we'll see some of these consequences begin to take hold of the family. And for me, I kind of see a bit of picture of this. It speaks a bit like sin as an infection of the family. And I think we've all experienced this to some degree or another. I've experienced it for the last sort of 2 months, which has been fantastic, where one of our families gets sick, and then the next week, the next one will get sick, and then the next week, the following one will get sick. Lucy is sick at home today, so I look forward to my sickness coming during the week. But the narrative here where David's talking about acts a little bit in the same way. Sin brought in through David begins to infect those in his family. See, David chose the wrong path by allowing sexual immorality and murder in, and has now spread it to his family. because that is what sin does. It rarely, if ever, affects the person that sinned or only the person that sinned. It affects all the people around him. Just like in Genesis, one action taken affects the entire world. The first is the death of his infant son, whom Bathsheba gave birth to. Upon David's confession, God takes away his sin, which is a little bit ambiguous, a lot of scholars argue, but it is taken away and says that he won't die. However, because of what he did, it seems like death needs to occur. It's that serious. Now, we must sympathize with Bathsheba here. She's an innocent victim who has to deal with the fallout of what David has done. But that's what sin does. It doesn't just hurt the person that sinned, it affects all of the people around them, family, relationships, and community. Another consequence comes from another of David's sons. Amnon falls in love and becomes obsessed with his sister. Now, David had many wives, so they are half siblings, but it's still not a great situation. Amnon schemes to get alone with his sister and then assaults and rapes her despite her objections. He then immediately rejects her and hates her. And in this cultural context, as well as ours, but specifically in this cultural context, what he has done brings great shame on Tamar and marks her out essentially as used goods. It is a sentence that is not deserved and was forced upon her by sin. The infection of sin begins to spread. But that isn't all. When Absalom, Tamar's brother, finds out what happens, he is rightly angry and hates Amnon for what he has done. Later, through more scheming, Absalom orders his men to kill Amnon. Now the infection is spreading again. Like David's assassination of Uriah, now his family uses the sword to solve their issues. Then, to make matters worse, Absalom now conspires to take the throne from David. After a brief political coup, David is forced from the kingdom. And I think it's this point that we see maybe this is heading in a similar direction to Saul, with the once great king falling away from those previous victories, those previous accolades, and now towards death. However, David's story isn't as simple as that. There's an element of redemption that is a key to in this story of David, a glimmer of hope in and amongst this mess. See, David has many loyal followers, and people who know that he is a man of God and will even follow him into disaster. They will stand and fight with David when the time comes. But more importantly than that, God is still with David. His promise that he made all the way back is still in play. God, forever faithful, wouldn't let David come to ruin. He was a part of what God was doing, and thus he needed to stay the course. We read in chapter 17 that the Lord had determined to frustrate the advice that was given to Absalom so that he wouldn't succeed, even amongst what is seemingly chaos, not the plan that we thought was happening. God is still working. As David's men march out against Absalom, we see that 20,000 men died in this battle. The infection of sin that began as a small act has now spread to affect families across the nation of Israel. Finally, Absalom is found and, despite David's wishes, is killed by one of his men. And so David is able to return to Jerusalem to be king. It is an epic story of the consequence of sin and of our actions, the downfall of a leader. But it seems to end on this kind of funny positive note. It seems strange that after David's sinful act, which leads to dishonor, death, and destruction, he should be back on the throne. Surely, in the eyes of God, that means his actions deserve punishment. And that doesn't resolve in him kind of being right again. So what do we do with this? How do we make sense of a story like this? Very confusing. Okay, how are we doing? That was a lot of story time, but I promise you it is leading somewhere. This whole section of Scripture, and really I think both 1st and 2nd Samuel have something that they are leading us to. It all points towards something. See, despite the actions of David and the evil that exists in these stories, which really is evil, God is still at work. Amongst the mess, destruction, he is still moving the story forward towards his redemptive purposes. And while God opposed David's pride and his actions, he exalted him and lifted him back to leadership once he had humbled himself. He was made strong in his weakness through God's actions. And this is leading us to something, a bigger picture. Through a story of chaos and sin and death, God is working out his promise. And just like there was for David in amongst the mess, there is also a promise for us. David is a shadow of the true king to come. He was raised to power because God is faithful and his promises, which urges us towards the fact that God is faithful in that same promise in and through the true king, Jesus. Jesus, the one who forgives our sins and takes away our blame, who delivers us, who allows us to stand holy and righteous before God because of what was achieved on the cross. The King who shows us the Father is waiting at the end of the road with his arms open, ready to accept us and love us regardless of what we have done. This is why it's called good news, because Jesus is a good King who wants to rule over our lives with love and compassion, like that of a father running towards his son, not caring about the way that his life has gone, but instead celebrates and embraces him. And like David receiving the promise, we have an opportunity to receive that same promise. And we have an opportunity to respond to that promise. So there are three things I want us to take away from today, three actions that we can take that allow ourselves to respond to the promise. And the first is confession. Confession's a funny thing. We've kind of lost that in the modern church. It was a huge part of the early church, and obviously the Catholic Church is still a big part of what we do. In a sort of mainline Protestant churches, we don't have this practice of confession. But there's actually a lot of power in it. David is caught out in his lie. He hides it, tries to ensure he doesn't get out, but ultimately is exposed by Nathan. You'll notice, however, that when he is exposed, he doesn't try to shift the blame. He doesn't try and make excuses. He uses 5 words: I have sinned against the Lord. He expresses the deep reality of what has occurred. He confesses. He shows up before God, honest and vulnerable for what he has done. The act of confession was, by and large, like I said, been lost by the church. And I could probably spend a whole sermon talking about confession, but I won't do that now. What I do want to do is give a little quote from a guy called Tyler Staton. He's a pastor in America, and he wrote a book called Praying Like Monks, Living Like Fools. And it says, one of the names thrown around for Jesus is the great physician. But a doctor can't heal you without an accurate diagnosis. If you show up to a great doctor and describe yourself as generally sick, they're not going to be able to do a lot for you. To confess is to say, I want to name my symptoms completely and comprehensively because I want healing completely and comprehensively. So confess. Come openly to God and express where you have missed the mark in your life. Name it. Be specific about it. And allow Jesus, the great doctor, to heal you. And then, if you're feeling really bold, confess to one another. In James 5, we read, if they have sinned, they will be forgiven. Therefore, confess your sins to each other and pray for each other so that you may be healed. You know, I've done this. I've got someone that I'm trying to meet with regularly where I can just sit down and just confess. Now, there's no... it's not a therapy session. It's not a 5-point on how I can fix my life. It is simply to sit with him and just confess where I'm potentially missing a mark. And then he prays for me and says, I'm forgiven because I am through Jesus. Imagine the power of a church where everyone feels safe to confess where they're struggling and how through prayer and the power of God, we can actually be healed together. The second is humility. Once David is thrown out of his kingdom, he is a humbled man. He accepts the reality he is in and is humble towards those around him, even those who insult him. You can read more about that. Grieves the death of his enemies, and for all his faults, David actually embraces his humanity. He is humble. And even more so, Jesus, the Son of God, humbles himself, Think of when he washes the feet of the disciples, a radical act of humility. He is the perfect embodiment of humility and our example to look towards. See, so often acts of sin begin as pride in our lives. Humility destroys pride. And so if we can humble ourselves, our pride won't stop us running towards God. We will be able to approach the throne open-armed towards God. And finally, hope. As I said earlier, we have a promise given by God through Jesus Christ. Just as David continued to live as God's anointed, regardless of the sin in his life, we too have this same promise. This promise of our true identity, adoption into the family of God. And in Romans we read, now that we are children, then we are heirs, heirs of God and co-heirs with Christ, if indeed we share in his sufferings in order that we may also share in his glory. This is the hope that we live into. You know, when David committed his great sin against Bathsheba and was called out by Nathan, his response was confession, but he also wrote a psalm. And many of you may know it. In this psalm, David is crying out for hope. And the psalm starts, have mercy on me, O God, according to your unfailing love, according to your great compassion. Blot out my transgressions, wash away all my iniquity, and cleanse me from my sin. His hope was that God would be able to give in him a pure heart and cleanse him. He knew deeply sin was embedded in his life, but he had hope beyond that and cried out to God. Because of Jesus' death on the cross, because of the good news, we have that exact same hope. Through the gospel, Jesus has taken sin on himself, and the promise that there is no sin too bad, no heart too wicked, no life too broken that he cannot cleanse it. Jesus' resurrection means that there is no story, there is no situation that he cannot restore. Know that today in your lives. There is nothing happening in your life, as dark as it may seem, as hard as it may be, as far as you think you have fallen. There is nothing that Jesus cannot restore. Because of Christ, we have hope, and our role is to simply live into that hope. So I want to invite the band up for a moment, and the reason I want to do that is that I get a sense that potentially today there are some who are feeling that. They are feeling that they have strayed too far from God's purpose for their life, or they feel like something has happened in their life that means that they actually can't have that love of God. While we sing this last song, I would love for you to come to the back and ask for some prayer. We'll have some elders. I'll head up the back as well. Mark will be there. If you feel that you need prayer, that you need someone to be with, if you feel you need to confess, if you feel that you just need someone to sit and pray with you, please head to the back during this song. Take the offer up. If you don't currently know Jesus, that offer is there for you as well. Come and speak with one of us. We would be happy to talk through what it looks like to live a life under the rule of Jesus Christ. And so I want to quickly pray, and then as we sing this song, we will be up the back. And please feel free to come up and chat to us. We're friendly, we don't bite, but we are open to being with you and loving you. So let me pray. Jesus, we want to thank you for the promise that was made by God and that you carried out on the cross through your death and resurrection, that we now have a hope that we can live into, a promise that was made long ago through all of the kings, all of the stories, all of the mess and all of the sin, yet still marches towards the ultimate goal of coming back into relationship with God. And we thank you that we have the opportunity to sit in that, be a part of that family, adopted and be co-heirs with Christ. And so I just want to pray for anyone right now that is struggling with their life, with sin that has been against them, whatever it is, Lord. I want to pray for them right now that, Spirit, you would be speaking to them and that you would be healing them, that they would feel your love wrapped around them and they would know that they are a loved person, they are a child of God, and they are adopted into the family of God. We just want to lift these people up to you right now and pray this in your name. Amen.